There used to live a man in Glasgow whose name could silence an entire pub. Even the city's hardest gangs were afraid to cross him. We are talking about James Jimber McClean. If you are not from Glasgow, you have probably never heard of him. But ask around Cranhill or Springburn or anywhere near the East End, and you will see faces change when you mention that name. By his 20s, he was already serving time for armed robbery and working alongside some of Scotland's most feared criminals. On the streets, he became known for torture, shootings, and brutal debt collections. That's how he earned the title of Glasgow's deadliest enforcer. But then he did something that crossed every line. Something so violent, even other gangsters started to fear him. So, what did he do? And what dark conspiracy still shadows his name today? Before he became Glasgow's most feared man, Jimber was just another kid from a rough corner of the city. Springburn in the 1970s wasn't easy. Poverty, gangs, and street fights were as common as rain here. Some kids grew up playing football in the streets. Jimber grew up stealing the cars parked beside them. He bragged that he learned to drive when he was 7 by hot wiring motors and tearing down back roads before most kids had learned to ride a bike. He was addicted to adrenaline, not drugs. At least not yet. By his teens, he was already knee-deep in trouble. It was because of ram raids, car thefts, and local jobs for petty gangs. By the late 80s, his record caught up with him. In 1987, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison for a £20,000 armed robbery at the New Inn in Glasgow. He was in his early 20s. And prison didn't slow him down. That's where he met Paul Ferris. Ferris was already infamous, known for working under Arthur Thompson Sr., the godfather of Glasgow crime. Later, Ferris would be accused and acquitted of murdering Thompson's son, but that's another story. Inside those prison walls, Ferris saw something in Jimber. Not loyalty, and definitely not charm, but fearlessness, the kind that cannot be faked, that made him valuable and dangerous. After getting out, Ferris built his own firm, and Jimber became his right hand. They weren't running banks or nightclubs, their business was based on control, and in the Glasgow of the early 90s, control equaled violence. Witnesses from that era described him the same way, that he was polite, calm, and absolutely terrifying. You wouldn't see him shout, you would see him look. That was enough, and soon his name began spreading beyond Glasgow. At some point, Ferris and McClean made their way to London, invited for a Christmas get-together by mutual contacts. Big names were there, including the Sabini family, old London faces from the gang scene, and Ray Betson, one of the men tied to the legendary diamond robbery. You can imagine the atmosphere. Expensive suits, gold watches, and enough ego in the room to sink a ship. Then, as expected, things went sideways. They ended up in an Arab-run pub, and a small argument exploded into a massive bar fight. Bottles were smashed, tables were flipped, and fists were flown. Ferris almost got taken down in the chaos, but it was Jimber who pulled him out, dragging him through the door like it was just another Tuesday night. That part is true. Everyone agrees on it. What came next, though, depends on who you believe. Years later, in an interview with the Daily Record, Jimber claimed he had taken a £25,000 hit job for the London mob. He said he shot a man in the back of the head, took him to a scrapyard, and burned the body in a furnace. He even said he had killed 4 people for the IRA and tortured many more. Back home in Cranhill, people knew that exact version of him. The version that walked into a shop and made everyone fall silent. The version that could collect a debt without lifting a finger. A source once said, he had a coldness in his eyes. The kind of look that made you believe he'd take things further than anyone else. And maybe he would have. People were genuinely terrified of him. He did a lot of work for others, not for the spotlight. Just for cash. But by the time the Daily Record ran that explosive piece in 2019, James Jimber McClean was already falling apart. The feared Glasgow enforcer, who once made grown men cry in Cranhill, was now a broken figure. His body, his mind, both were wrecked. Years earlier, in the mid-2000s, he had been shot in the stomach during a feud that spiraled out of control. The bullet nearly killed him. He survived, but it left him with constant pain, infections, and a stomach surgery that changed his life. After that, he was never the same. People close to him said the old fire was gone. The man who once stared down rivals without blinking now spent days numb, chasing peace in powder and smoke. Friends admitted he was hooked on heroin and cocaine. He would use them as medicine to silence the chaos in his head. The fearsome enforcer had gone quiet. When that final interview came out, the public was stunned. He confessed to abductions, torture, and murders, bragging about a £25,000 hit job in London and claiming he had killed for the IRA. Then, in the same breath, he said something that shocked everyone. When I die, I'll be going straight to heaven. I've done nothing wrong. So, in Jimber's mind, he wasn't a villain. He was the hand of justice. He believed snitches and traitors got what they deserved. The world called him a monster. He thought he was cleaning up monsters. And that contradiction, that clash between fear and faith, is what makes his story so unsettling. But not everything about him fit the stereotype of a ruthless hitman. Even Paul Ferris, his old ally, once admitted there was something strange about Jimber's life. Back in the late 1980s, when they were running jobs together, Jimber was always available, except on Tuesday nights. Nobody knew why. His crew thought maybe he had another gig, or worse, another boss. One night, they followed him, and what they found was something nobody could have imagined. He wasn't meeting gangsters. He wasn't collecting debts. He was sitting in a bingo hall. So yes, Glasgow's most feared enforcer, surrounded by grannies with floral handbags, laughing beside his wife and blushing when one of them called him James. Ferris later said, "The deadliest man in Glasgow, and he's at the bingo." And he wasn't wrong. It became Jimber's secret escape, a world where nobody screamed and nobody feared him. It was the one part of his life that made him feel human again. Then came the 2000s, when Paul Ferris started writing after coming out of prison. His books, The Ferris Conspiracy in 2001 and Villains in 2003, reignited Glasgow's dark history. Ferris claimed the gang wars were not just turf battles over drugs and money. He said MI5 and the National Crime Squad were manipulating everything, turning gangsters into informants, framing rivals, even using hitmen as pawns. And yes, Jimber McClean's name was all over those pages. If Ferris was telling the truth, it meant Jimber might not have just been a local thug. He might have been tangled in something far bigger. Maybe those IRA connections he bragged about weren't just talk. Maybe the London hit story wasn't entirely fake. Maybe he was part of a machine he never fully understood. Of course, not everyone buys that theory. Some say Ferris exaggerated to sell books. Others believe the evidence was buried a long time ago. Either way, Jimber's name remains glued to that shadowy side of Glasgow's history. Half fact, half ghost story. By the time he reached his early 50s, his body finally gave up. Decades of violence, addiction, and surgeries caught up with him. Friends said he could barely hold a conversation. The once calm man who could control a room with a stare now struggled to string together a thought. He was living proof that every crime legend ends the same. It always goes into decline. On the 29th of June 2019, James Jimber McClean died in a Glasgow hospital, just 53 years old. The cause was complications from long-term illness. The Daily Record broke the news that the man who had once ruled by fear was gone. He had a quiet death after causing years of chaos. When word spread, something strange happened. The same locals who used to cross the street when they saw him started telling stories. Some with fear, some with pity. They spoke of the man who terrified a neighborhood and the man who blushed at bingo. So who was he, really? A criminal? Definitely. A killer? Possibly. But he was also a man who fell apart trying to survive in a world built on paranoia and revenge. He lived fast, hit hard, and never apologized. He scared the right people, lied to the wrong ones, and left a city that still cannot decide if he was a devil or just another casualty of Glasgow's dark past. Because whether you believe the London hit, the IRA rumours, or none of it at all, one thing is certain. In his prime, James Jimber McClean was the man who made Glasgow hold its breath, and even now, decades later, it still hasn't let it out. Let's be clear, this is not some attempt to paint James Jimber McClean as a misunderstood hero. He wasn't. He terrorised Glasgow, he hurt people, he made families afraid to answer their doors. And he thrived on that fear. For years, he ruled the East End like a ghost in daylight. The crimes he admitted to are not just stories. They included kidnapping, torture, and possible murder. These crimes are traumatic for the people who lived through that time. You don't erase that because he went to bingo on Tuesdays or smiled at old women. Those moments don't balance the scale. They just remind us how human monsters can look when they are not doing monstrous things. Even Paul Ferris never denied the damage they caused. He said himself that the lifestyle destroyed more people than it ever rewarded. His story became complicated around the time Ferris began publishing his books. In the early 2000s, rumours started that not everything about Glasgow's underworld was what it seemed. Ferris claimed MI5 and Scotland's Serious Crime Squad were pulling strings behind the scenes. He claimed that it was M15 and the Serious Crime Squad who were turning gangsters into informants and letting some crimes slide to keep bigger fish in play. For example, the 1991 Thompson murder trial, where Ferris was accused and later cleared, was said to be riddled with leaks from police and intelligence insiders. Then there was the gun-running case that landed Ferris in prison in 1997. He swore MI5 set him up, using fake weapons trails to cover their own network of informants. And somewhere in that same shadowy network sat Jimber McClean. His name came up again and again. Was he working for people higher up? Was he being used by them? We will never know for sure, but it's hard not to notice how neatly his story fits the pattern. A violent man who rose fast, became useful, and then burned out right when the system no longer needed him. What do you think is the truth? Share your theory with us in the comments below. If you want to know more about the dark history of Britain's underworld, make sure to subscribe to our channel. There are still plenty of terrifying secrets about the gangs of the UK that you haven't heard yet.